In AP Lang, we read works of literature for two reasons. The first reason is that if we didn't read literature during your junior year, you would miss out on all of the major works of American literature because the 11th grade year is where you're typically most exposed. It's supposed to be devoted strictly to American literature. But the other reason is that we want to better understand how works of literature can be used to persuade. Literary texts are not primarily concerned with persuasion, but the stories and the characters that we read in them can still be highly persuasive, can still teach us things. The struggles of characters with the various outside forces they encounter, for instance, can teach us a lot about society, specifically its flaws. The various internal struggles that the characters go through can teach us a lot about the human condition, the human experience. And the fact that we're reading about people rather than just ideas can make the ideas that they represent feel really compelling. This is why when we read literature in AP Lang, we don't focus so much on literary elements like plot and characterization and conflict, so much as on the big ideas that all of those elements communicate. It's a lot like exploring themes, but instead we frame our study as analyzing the various arguments that a work of literature makes. So the reason I'm making this quick lesson is that many students struggle with the open-ended questions that we have on our reading quizzes. Those questions that usually ask something like this: what is one significant argument that so-and-so makes throughout this text? Give one particular scene as an example of this, something like that. And a lot of students are having tons of trouble answering those questions. Now, this is partly due just to unfamiliarity with the text. You know who you are. But many of you just don't seem to be following the directions or answering just what the question is asking. So let's take a look now at a sample question and model response. All right, here's the kind of question that you might see on one of those reading quizzes. What is one significant argument that Hawthorne seems to make about American society's treatment of criminals in the Scarlet Letter? So it's asking us to identify a significant argument. We know that an argument is made up of at least two parts, claim and evidence. We know there's a third part, but that third part is often unspoken, the assumption. So our response to this question needs to be made up of two statements, a claim statement and an evidence statement. And we also know that in order for a claim statement to be properly supported by an evidence statement, there needs to be at least, not at least, but exactly one matching term between them. So the argument we need to identify for this particular question needs to be about society's treatment of criminals, and it needs to be something that's supported by the story in the Scarlet Letter. Now, to figure this out, since the Scarlet Letter is a novel and not an essay, we can't just point to exactly where this argument is made. We instead have to do some inferencing. So the criminals in this story are really just two people, Hester and Dimmesdale. But since Hester is the only one punished by her society, she's really the only one that we can look to kind of infer Hawthorne's argument here. Remember, Dimmesdale largely, he escapes societal punishment. He has his own little internal punishment, but that's not really what the question's asking about. So let's focus on Hester. Yeah, we need to focus on how Hester is treated by her society based on her status as a criminal, having committed a crime within that community. The way that she's publicly mocked and shamed, the way that she's made to wear that symbol on her clothing that is a symbol of her crime, the way that she's really stripped of all privacy and really any dignities within the community. Now, this question is asking us what arguments Hawthorne is making about American society. And we have a story about a Puritan society, and we need to understand, yeah, Puritan society is not the same as modern American society. You know, a lot of the what the Puritans believed in as far as their particular brand of Protestantism, that's largely gone. However, a lot of their attitudes and ideals have had kind of a lingering influence over how we feel about things today. And it definitely seems to have affected how we treat our criminals. After all, we also treat crimes, we make them highly publicized in the media. If you've ever heard that term or the phrase trial by media before, that's definitely common in our society today. We make big events out of crimes, and the criminals themselves, we widely treat them as less than deserving of the same rights and dignities that the rest of us have. So in a lot of ways, we still kind of treat our criminals the same way that these early Puritan American societies did. So here then is an argument that I can say that Hawthorne is trying to make through the Scarlet Letter. My claim is that American society believes its criminals are undeserving of dignity. My evidence statement is that American society treats criminals and their crimes as public spectacles. And of course, my assumption here is connecting the last two unmatched terms, that treating someone's behavior as a public spectacle is a way of denying them dignity. So when I respond to this question, what is one significant argument that Hawthorne seems to make about American society's treatment of criminals in the Scarlet Letter? My response is just going to be one complete sentence. I'm just going to identify the claim and the evidence. Hawthorne seems to argue that American society believes its criminals are undeserving of dignity because we treat them and their crimes as public spectacles. Now, the open-ended questions on the reading quizzes come in two parts. The second part asks about one specific scene or part of the text that supports this argument. So we need to look back at the text at where exactly Hester is treated in the way that we've talked about. Yeah, Hester's poor treatment by her community, we see that throughout the book, but the question's asking us to pick one particular scene or part to use as evidence. We can't just write that she was generally mocked and scorned by the townspeople. We need a specific instance of this being mentioned or described in the book. So there's two obvious parts of the novel that jump out to me. First of all is the scaffold scene in chapter 2, where she's first brought out before the public to be shamed. And then there's the narration of what her life was like after she was released from prison in chapter 5. But we're just asked for one part or scene, and we have a limited word count, so we need to pick just one of these. Let's go with the narration from chapter 5. That's one of my favorite parts of the book. So my evidence for the argument that I've chosen is that Hawthorne's narrator opens up chapter 5 by discussing Hester's release from prison and sort of describes what Hester then encountered on any given day. Chapter 5 doesn't deal with any particular day in Hester's story. It just kind of talks about what her day-to-day life was after she was released. The way that she would often be stopped by ministers in the street who would stop her to preach a sermon about her to people gathered around. How flocks of children would sort of follow her through town and taunt her, shouting names and words at her that they clearly didn't understand the meaning of, but had only heard from their parents. Also how her customers, remember she was a very industrious and very popular seamstress in the community, even her customers would appreciate her work but give her dirty looks the whole time that they were accepting it, that sort of thing. So those are some of the things in chapter 5 that we could talk about. We also need to make sure that we understand that we can explain how these examples from the text relate back to the argument here. We need to acknowledge that, yes, the Puritan religious faith is largely gone today, but their attitudes still influence a lot of our attitudes, and that, just like the Puritans did in their time, we treat our criminals today as undeserving of privacy rights, dignity, etc. We heap that on top of the punishments, the jail sentences, and things like that we give our criminals. So we want to acknowledge all of that in our explanations. So our final response to this question is going to be longer than the previous one because there's a lot more to it than just one sentence can answer. But here's what I wrote. In chapter 5, after Hester is released from her prison sentence, we learn that her additional punishment for committing adultery, wearing the scarlet letter in public, serves as an even harsher consequence. The narrator explains that every time she would go out into the village, ministers would stop her in the street to preach impromptu sermons to crowds of people about her sins, and groups of children would follow her wherever she went and shout at her, calling Hester words they didn't understand but had only heard from their parents. As one of the earliest groups to settle America, the Puritans planted the seeds that influence many of our attitudes today, including our habit of stripping criminals of their rights to dignity on top of their punishments. All right, so just to recap this two-part question here. Question one, what is one significant argument Hawthorne seems to make about society's treatment of criminals in the Scarlet Letter? And here's my argument. Hawthorne seems to argue that American society believes its criminals are undeserving of dignity because we treat them and their crimes as public spectacles. And then question two, what's one specific scene or part of the text that supports this? Well, in chapter 5, after Hester is released from her prison sentence, we learn that her additional punishment for committing adultery, wearing that scarlet letter in public, serves as an even harsher consequence. The narrator explains that every time she would go out into the village, ministers would stop her in the street to preach impromptu sermons to crowds of people about her sins, and groups of children would follow her wherever she went and shout at her, calling Hester words they didn't understand but had only heard from their parents. As one of the earliest groups to settle America, Puritans planted the seeds that influence many of our attitudes today, including our habit of stripping criminals of their rights to dignity on top of their punishments. One final note here, remember the best responses will always be responses that are focused, specific, and detailed. Focused meaning you don't have any unnecessary extra information trying to pad your word count. Specific meaning you could point exactly to where it talks about that in the book. And detailed meaning that it sounds like you actually read the book and not just a summary of it or paid attention to something I said in class.